She told me I made her feel young again, and suddenly, everything between us changed. The first time I really noticed her, it wasn't dramatic, there was no grand entrance, no cinematic music playing. It was an ordinary afternoon, sunlight spilling across the quiet suburban street. I had been carrying a small box of groceries to my apartment when I saw her tending her garden next door. She moved with a quiet elegance, her hands gentle but purposeful as they brushed over the blossoms, adjusting the petals as if speaking to them in a language only she could understand. Her hair caught the light in soft golden strands, and for a moment, everything else seemed to blur. When I waved, she looked up with a smile that made the air feel warmer. There was a subtle strength in her presence, a calm confidence that didn't need to announce itself. And yet, behind that poise, I sensed a quiet vulnerability, a softness that made her approachable. She glanced at me, her eyes lingering just a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I felt the first stirrings of something I couldn't quite name. Our first physical touch was accidental, almost inconsequential, a brush of hands as she handed me a small packet of sugar I had borrowed. The brief contact left a strange warmth trailing through me, a fleeting electricity that made me notice the texture of her skin, the gentle pressure of her fingers against mine. It was innocent, but loaded with unspoken possibilities. I felt my heartbeat quicken in a way that surprised me, and I caught myself replaying the moment long after we had parted. I tried to make sense of the feeling. She was a woman in her 40s, confident and composed, far removed from the world I usually inhabited. And yet, something about her laughter, light and easy, drew me in. It wasn't just attraction, it was the sense that time slowed whenever she was near, that small moments became charged with a warmth I hadn't noticed before. Walking away, I realized that this was the start of something subtle but undeniable. The curiosity, the warmth, and the flutter of tension all mingled together in a quiet promise, that these casual encounters might grow into something far more significant. But for now, it was just a fleeting glimpse, a brief brush of hands, a shared smile, and the unspoken acknowledgement that neither of us would forget this ordinary afternoon. And in that moment, I knew life had shifted slightly, imperceptibly, yet irrevocably. It didn't take long for our paths to cross again. The first time was accidental, the second felt almost inevitable. I was stepping out to check the mail when I noticed her at the mailbox a few doors down, balancing a stack of letters with the kind of grace that made even mundane tasks seem elegant. She looked up, our eyes met, and for a moment the world narrowed to just that shared gaze. I offered a small smile, she returned it, soft and knowing, as if she remembered our brief touch from the garden. Our encounters became a quiet rhythm, each one ordinary yet charged with a subtle energy. At the corner store, she reached for the same carton of milk, our hands brushing lightly. The warmth lingered, a silent acknowledgement of something neither of us could, or perhaps wanted to, name. When I helped carry groceries down the hall or offered her a hand with a heavy bag, her fingers would meet mine in that fleeting, weightless way that left a trace long after we parted. Her presence began to feel like sunlight on a chilly day, gentle, warm, and unavoidably comforting. I started noticing details I hadn't before, the faint scent of her perfume, a mix of jasmine and something soft, powdery, lingering in the air long after she walked by, the way her laughter had an easy cadence, the kind that made even trivial jokes feel meaningful, the subtle tilt of her head when she was listening intently, her eyes not just seeing me, but noticing. Each encounter stirred something inside me I hadn't expected, curiosity, excitement, and a growing awareness of the age gap between us. But those thoughts were always tempered by respect. There was no rush, no need to act, just the quiet thrill of shared moments, small and human. It was during one of these unplanned meetings that she paused, her hand brushing against my arm as we reached for the same mailbox key. Her touch was fleeting, almost incidental, yet it sent a pulse of warmth up my arm. Our eyes met, and for a heartbeat, words felt unnecessary. She smiled softly, and I realized I was holding my breath without even noticing. By the end of the day, I found myself replaying the encounters, noticing the way my heart seemed lighter around her, the way small touches lingered in memory like faint sparks. Each unexpected meeting built a rhythm between us, a gentle, unspoken connection that promised something more, even if neither of us dared to name it. And somewhere in that quiet, I began to hope that these everyday moments weren't just coincidences, they were the start of something quietly profound. It was a rainy afternoon when our casual acquaintance began to feel more personal. I had stopped by her house to return a borrowed book, expecting a quick exchange, but she invited me in, insisting I stay out of the drizzle. The warm, earthy scent of her home wrapped around me, mingling with the faint aroma of freshly brewed tea. The soft patter of rain against the windows created a quiet backdrop, turning the room into a cocoon where ordinary rules felt suspended. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. There was a moment when she just looked at me, eyes steady yet distant, and I realized she was holding back something, a story, a memory, a part of herself she hadn't shared before. She spoke quietly at first, recalling a past filled with both triumphs and regrets, her voice tinged with a vulnerability I hadn't seen in her before. I listened, my own pulse slowing as I absorbed her words. Her fingers traced the rim of the mug absent-mindedly, and I found myself noticing the delicate curve of her nails, the warmth radiating from her hands. At some point, almost instinctively, my hand moved to rest lightly over hers. The touch was soft, tentative, yet the connection was immediate. Her gaze lifted, meeting mine, and for a moment, the room felt suspended between the ordinary and something quietly profound. There was no rush, no expectation, only presence. The subtle warmth of her hand against mine spoke volumes, revealing a trust that both comforted and unsettled me. I felt the weight of the age gap, the unspoken boundaries we hadn't crossed, but the moment itself felt natural, human, and significant. She shared stories of love lost and choices she sometimes questioned, her voice faltering slightly as she confessed fears she rarely voiced. I offered empathy, careful to speak softly, leaning in just enough to convey attention and care without overwhelming her. Each word, each glance, built a bridge between our worlds, blending life experience with youthful perspective. By the time I left, the rain had stopped, leaving a freshness in the air that mirrored the quiet shift in our connection. I walked away aware that this encounter had changed something fundamental. Our relationship was no longer defined merely by casual encounters or polite smiles. It had deepened into something nuanced, a shared space where vulnerability, trust, and subtle desire could coexist, even unspoken. And in that quiet reflection, I realized that the warmth lingering in my chest was not just from her hand resting in mine, it was from the recognition that, for the first time, we had met each other fully, without pretense, and that realization left me both exhilarated and profoundly aware of the delicate tension between us. It wasn't a dramatic moment that shifted the dynamic between us, it was the accumulation of small gestures, ordinary interactions that suddenly felt significant. One afternoon, she asked for help rearranging some boxes in her living room. I expected it to be a simple task, but there was a rhythm to it that neither of us spoke about. Our hands brushed repeatedly as we lifted and shifted boxes, each accidental contact lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. The warmth of her touch seemed to linger in my palm, and I caught myself savoring it, though I didn't dare let it show. Later, we ended up sitting on the couch to rest. She leaned slightly toward me, her shoulder brushing mine, a casual closeness that sent a quiet thrill through my chest. The space between us felt charged, but not in a way that demanded words. Her presence was grounding, like the calm after a storm, yet there was an undeniable electricity in the air. When our fingers met briefly while reaching for the same pen, I felt the soft pressure of her hand against mine, the subtle warmth radiating, and it left me both aware and breathless. Even our laughter had taken on a new intimacy. As we joked about trivial things, the stubborn boxes, the awkward angles of furniture, we found ourselves leaning closer to hear each other over our own chuckles. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the softness of her smile, and the unspoken comfort she seemed to radiate. Every small interaction became a chance to connect, a shared moment that felt deliberately private despite the mundanity of the setting. There was a quiet intensity in her presence. I caught glimpses of it in how she would tilt her head slightly when listening, or in the way her hand rested lightly near mine when she was thinking. These gestures were not declarations, but whispers of closeness, subtle threads weaving an invisible bond. Even the scent of her perfume, a soft, warm hint of jasmine, seemed to linger longer around me, a reminder of her nearness. By the end of the day, I realized that the tension between us wasn't desperate or urgent, it was patient, understated, and profoundly human. Every brush of hands, every shared glance, every accidental shoulder touch built an emotional intimacy that words could not capture. We were learning each other slowly, letting closeness grow without force, savoring the quiet rhythm of affection that neither of us felt ready to name aloud. And as I walked home that evening, my thoughts lingered on the gentle warmth of her hand against mine, the laughter echoing softly in my mind, and the quiet realization that affection, in its simplest form, could speak louder than anything either of us had dared to say. It was one of those evenings that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. The rain had returned, tapping gently against the windows and casting soft shadows across the room. The air was heavy with the comforting scent of warm tea and polished wood. We found ourselves sitting close on the couch, a shared blanket draped loosely over our legs, the world outside fading into quiet obscurity. There was no urgency in the room, only a steady, patient closeness that made every glance and every breath feel significant. She turned toward me, her eyes reflecting the soft light of the room, and for a moment, she didn't speak. I could feel the subtle rhythm of her breathing, a quiet steadiness that contrasted with the thrum of my own heart. Then, almost shyly, her fingers brushed against mine. It was deliberate this time, lingering long enough for warmth to spread up my arm and settle somewhere in my chest. "You always make me feel young again," she said quietly, almost a whisper, as if confessing a secret she had held onto for too long. The words hung in the air between us, fragile yet full of meaning. I felt a rush of emotions I couldn't immediately name, delight, fear, longing, and an overwhelming sense of closeness. Her gaze stayed on mine, steady and honest, and I realized that everything we had been feeling in those small touches, shared glances, and lingering laughter had led us here, to this unspoken acknowledgement. I hesitated, my mind caught between desire and the weight of respect. The age difference, the boundaries, the unspoken societal expectations, they all pressed against the pull of this quiet intimacy. And yet, as I held her gaze, I understood that what we were sharing transcended all of that. It wasn't reckless, it was human, tender, and profoundly real. Her hand remained lightly on mine, fingers tracing tiny, careful patterns, a touch that spoke of trust, care, and subtle longing. I felt the warmth of her palm, the softness of her skin, the heartbeat beneath it, and I realized that connection didn't need words, it was alive in the space we shared. For the first time, I understood the depth of what we had built together. It was slow, deliberate, and patient, a bond of shared moments, gentle touches, and honest presence. And in that quiet evening, surrounded by the soft rhythm of rain and the comfort of a closeness that neither of us fully dared to name aloud, I realized something profound: intimacy isn't always about what's said. Sometimes it exists, powerfully, in the spaces between words, in a hand held a moment too long, in a glance that lingers, and in the silent acknowledgement that hearts can meet quietly, and completely. The days that followed our unspoken confession were filled with a new kind of awareness. Each encounter carried a weight of meaning, yet we both approached it cautiously, as if testing the waters of something delicate and profound. There was a subtle tension in the air, but it was tempered by warmth, respect, and the growing understanding that connection doesn't need to be rushed, it can evolve quietly, patiently, like a slow-burning fire. We spent more time together in ordinary ways, sharing small routines that suddenly felt charged with intimacy. Morning coffee on her porch, the faint scent of jasmine from her garden mixing with the aroma of freshly brewed beans. Her hand would brush mine as we passed a cup or reached for the sugar, lingering just enough to spark awareness. A light touch became a conversation in itself, a language neither of us needed to speak aloud. One afternoon, as we organized a few old boxes in her attic, our shoulders touched as we moved a stack of books. I felt the warmth of her arm against mine and the faint tremor in her hand as she steadied herself. It was a quiet acknowledgement of trust and shared effort, but beneath it ran a current of something deeper: desire, admiration, and an unspoken agreement that we were present for each other in a way that mattered. We also had moments of reflection, moments where vulnerability mingled with hesitation. She would glance at me with a fleeting smile, a mixture of affection and uncertainty, and I would feel a surge of protectiveness. Conversations became more honest, exploring life's regrets, fears, and small joys. I listened, careful to honor the trust she was offering, and she in turn noticed the sincerity in my eyes, the attentiveness in my gestures, the quiet patience in my presence. Through these shared moments, I realized something essential: the bond between us wasn't just romantic tension or fleeting attraction. It was emotional intimacy, built layer by layer, through laughter, small touches, gentle reassurances, and thoughtful presence. We were learning to navigate boundaries and desire with maturity, letting closeness grow naturally, and discovering that patience often deepens connection far more than impulsiveness ever could. By the evening, as we sat on the porch once more, her hand resting lightly on mine, I understood the depth of our growth. The warmth between us was steady now, a quiet flame that promised something lasting. Hesitation had not weakened us, it had strengthened our bond. And in that gentle realization, I felt the power of slow, careful love, the kind that blossoms fully only when hearts are ready to meet each other completely. It was a quiet evening when everything finally settled into a comforting rhythm. The sun was dipping low, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, and the world seemed to slow around us. We were sitting side by side on her porch, the warmth of the day still clinging to the wooden railing, shoulders brushing lightly, a subtle intimacy that no words could fully capture. There was a shared silence between us, but it was far from empty. It was filled with trust, understanding, and the delicate satisfaction of knowing that we had crossed the threshold of connection together. Her hand found mine effortlessly, fingers intertwining with a natural familiarity that spoke volumes. The simple act sent a gentle warmth through my chest, a steady pulse of closeness that felt both grounding and exhilarating. She smiled softly, and I noticed the slight crinkle at the corners of her eyes, the quiet assurance in her gaze that mirrored my own feelings. In that moment, the age gap, the hesitations, and the unspoken fears all faded, leaving only the human truth of what we shared, a deep, tender connection built on patience, respect, and genuine affection. We talked quietly, exchanging thoughts about the small joys of life, books we had read, memories that made us laugh, and the fleeting beauty of ordinary moments. Every glance lingered a beat longer than necessary, every touch was meaningful yet subtle, and every laugh felt like a shared secret. There was no need for dramatic declarations, our closeness had already said everything words could not. As the sun slipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I felt a profound sense of completion. We had arrived at a place where emotional intimacy and physical affection coexisted naturally. Her head tilted slightly toward mine as we watched the colors shift in the sky, the faintest brush of her hair against my cheek sending a comforting shiver down my spine. It was simple, yet infinitely significant, a quiet, tender affirmation of everything we had been building together. For the first time, I realized that love didn't always need to be urgent, loud, or dramatic. Sometimes, it was found in these gentle moments, in the warmth of a hand held just long enough, in shared laughter over trivial things, in the unspoken trust that grew with each day. The world felt softer, calmer, and infinitely richer because of her presence, and I knew she felt the same way. As the evening deepened and the first stars began to appear, I rested my head lightly near hers, feeling the steady beat of her heart against mine. In that quiet closeness, there was a profound understanding, we had found something lasting, tender, and real. Our connection was complete, not because of grand gestures, but because of the patient, steady affection we had nurtured together. And in that warmth, I knew we had arrived at a love that was as enduring as it was human. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more slow burn romances. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever felt a connection that transcends age or expectation? And check the link in the description to watch the full story unfold.